Hey, what's up, comrades? We're here. We're finally here. Second Genesis. So first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming to indulge me in my X-Men comic adventures. Go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. And yeah, so here we go. So we're starting with Uncanny X-Men Giant Size #1. And there's an interesting thing going on with the Giant Size issues, the X-Men Giant Size, because there's technically 3 of them. X-Men Giant Size #1 is Second Genesis. It's the original one written by Chris Claremont back in like the 70s, I want to say, still like 78 or something. And the story goes as thus. Professor X is recruiting a new batch of mutants. So we start off with Kurt Wagner, who eventually gets nicknamed Nightcrawler. I don't think he ever gets called Nightcrawler in the Giant Size. But so Kurt Wagner has the ability to teleport. And I'm just going to base it on what we know thus far. So he has the ability to teleport. He looks like a blue demon, and he's in this city in Germany, and the church or somebody has been like, get this demon and burn him at the stake and whatever. And then he gets grabbed, and he's like, no. And then all of a sudden everyone frees, like, please stop. And then everyone stops. He's like, oh, that was convenient. Why has everyone stopped? And the Professor X rolls up, and he's like, come, you're a mutant. Let's go do this. Next up, we get Wolverine, who's back in the Canadian government, and he gets summoned in by like his boss at Department H. I'm assuming they don't call it Department H here, but that's essentially what we eventually learn that it is. So, and the professor's like, hey, I was following your exploits with you and the Hulk, and you're a mutant, and I want to invite you to come along with us, and you can have freedom and not have to deal with these assholes in the Canadian government who are real assholes. And Wolverine's like, they are assholes. I 100% agree. Let's go. And then the guy's like, you can't just leave. We own you. And Wolverine's like, whips out one of his claws and literally flips him off with it and is like, you think you're going to stop me? I'll fuck you up. And he's like, deuces, bitches. So him and Professor leave, and then the Department H guy's like, oh, we'll come get you eventually. And he's like, whatever, bitch. Next we get Sean Cassidy, nicknamed the Banshee. I think we just call him the Banshee here. I don't know if we've gotten his name ever. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think he was called Sean Cassidy at some point. But so the Banshee, he's literally at the Grand Ole Opry in like Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, and Professor X like moseys on up to him while he's like enjoying a show, and he's like, hey, you want to join the X-Men? And Banshee's like, yeah, you know what? Fuck it, let's do it. Next up, we get a whole like pre-montage of Storm. So Storm, before she joined the X-Men, the little bit of information we get right now is that she was essentially seen as like a goddess of the storm. And we don't get her. Yeah, do we even call her Storm? Oh, it's so interesting. I don't remember. But Aurora Monroe, I think is her last name. She's essentially in, is it Kenya? I want to say. Yeah, I think so. And all these like tribal people are coming to like ask her for help with like rain and drought and stuff, and then Professor like calls to her in her brain, is like, hey, this is not for you. Not that you're like better than this, but I'm asking you to leave this like fantasy life to come help like your fellow mutants and to like serve mankind and do more good. And she's like, you know what? That's a good point. I should do that. And it's like from the get-go, Storm is so excellent. She's one of the best X-Men, period, ever. Just everything about her. As far as I've read up to like 97 or 95, it was just at gold across the board. She is such a good character. Just so well written consistently and just a noble and excellent. Anyway, so it's great to see her. Oh, goodness. Getting chills. And so she comes. Next up, Professor hits up Colossus. So Colossus is working on a collective farm in like Soviet Russia, as you do in the 70s. And there's a tractor that's about to hit his little sister Ileana, and he runs over, and then his mutant power blows up, and he becomes Colossus instead of Pietro. What's his name? Peter. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And then he destroys the Combine, and then Professor X like shows up, and he's like, "Hey, I need to take you to my school and to help you with mutant stuff and protect you." And then his dad's like. And then he's like, I don't know, Daddy, Papa, I want to stay here with you and the family, but I also feel the urge to go help the world and do whatever. And his papa's like, follow your heart, son. And he's like, oh, I guess I'll go. And he gives his mama a hug and a cry. He's like, I'll write you every week. And then they peace out. Next is Sunfire. If you remember Sunfire from like the end of the Uncanny X-Men, before Second Genesis, he's that asshole Japanese guy who tried to kill a bunch of people because his uncle was like a liar. But justifiably, he's still mad about the whole nuclear bomb thing and attacking his people as he should. What the fuck? Anyway. So, but he kind of reluctantly is like, all right, Professor, I'll come with you, and I'll see if I can do more good than just sitting here in my opulence, being wealthy Japanese lord, or whatever he is. Last of all, we get, I don't know if they name him in here. I call him Warpath. Warpath is actually the name of his little brother in New Mutants. They call him Warpath here? Or maybe not even New Mutants, X-Force. Anyway, but I'll correct myself later on in this video when I read some more books. But thus far, he's an Apache Indian, American Indian, and he's just very distraught about his people losing their way and not being strong and being like true warriors and taking care of stuff. And Professor X comes and is like, hey, you should come, you're a mutant, you can help the world and do all this stuff. And he's like, white man, get thy white eyes out of here. And the Professor X is like, oh, I didn't realize Apaches were such cowards. And he's like, what'd you say? All right, I'm coming. He literally just shames him into following after him. So they'll go back to the X Mansion and we get introduced to Cyclops. Obviously, we all know Cyclops. They get introduced to Cyclops. And it's like, wow, these people all speak different languages. How are they going to communicate? We get like a throwaway line. It's not a throwaway line. It's a very important line. That Professor X trains them all telepathically to speak English good, very fast. And it's like, oh, that makes sense. He can like read minds and stuff, so obviously can translate whatever. So Cyclops tells the story about how him and they found this giant dangerous mutant in this island in the sea called Krakoa, and they decided they were going to go investigate and find the mutant on there and decide the threat level. So they head out there, and then Cyclops like wakes up and he's back in like the jet they flew out there, and his powers don't work and he's like super confused. So he flies back to Professor X and is like, hey, I don't know what happened. And then his powers start working again, and then Professor X is like, your powers are stronger now than they were before. You got to like figure that out. I'm going to go get a crew, and then we'll send them over here and we'll try to rescue the X-Men. So they do. And that brings us back here. So then there's some like back and forth. Sunfire's like, I don't want to be any part of this. And it's like, bro, you came all the way from Japan to New York. What the fuck? And now you're like, nah, I'm good. All right. And then Walt's like, all right, motherfucker, see ya. And so they get in the jet and they start flying over and they're having like a little tiny bit of chit chat about stuff. And then Sunfire shows back up. He's like, all right, I'm coming. Just let me in the ship. So they get to Krakoa and they split up into 4 teams because there's 8 of them, I think. 4 teams of 2. So we get Cyclops. And we get Sunfire and Nightcrawler. We get Wolverine and Banshee. We get Aurora and Colossus. And then so that leaves Warpath and Cyclops, I'm pretty sure. So Cyclops and Warpath, and so we get little stories about each one of them. That's maybe like a page, if that, of them like fighting with creatures on the land, fighting with traps, and they all meet up at this like temple in the center. And Cyclops makes mention that this temple wasn't there before, but when they go inside, all the X-Men are there, and they're like, "Oh my gosh!" And so they like pull him out and rescue him, and then Angel's like, "Fool! This was a trap!" And that's when Krakoa, the whole island's like Krakoa, but this like swamp thing looking Krakoa monster pops up, and it's like time to fight. And so they fight, and the thing's like immune to that and immune to this, and it's like they're having a real tough struggle. And so then Professor X, from all the way in like New York, uses his telepathic powers to like assault the mind of the creature, and then they do some more like attacks on it, and that doesn't seem to be working. And then Professor X is like, oh, I'm passing out. So then he passes out, and then they combine like Lorna's powers with Aurora's, with Storm's, and like Jean Grey, and they create like this huge lightning storm and like strike the creature with like super powerful lightning with like water and everything. And then that didn't really work either, and they're like, fuck. And then Cyclops is like, all right, I got an idea. And so they supercharge like Lorna again, and she like shoots power that's like combined with like Havoc's and Cyclops's into the center, into like underneath the island, and create like a vortex of magnetic force or something. And then it starts to create a thing where they're essentially launching the island off the planet Earth. And then they're like, all right, it's working, let's go. And I'm like, cool, dope. That fucking plan sounded crazy, but I guess they got it to work. So they all run to the edge, and their ship got absorbed by the island. So like, oh fuck. So Iceman uses his super Iceman powers to create like a giant flotilla of ice, and they all climb on, and they're like, and then Cyclops and Havoc use their powers to like push them away from the island. But then the island shoots off into space, and after it shoots off into space, obviously there's like a huge hole in the water. So then whirlpool issues arise. So then Iceman just covers up the whole thing. That creates like a circle of ice. So they're all trapped in there, so they can like survive. And the ice obviously is going to like float back up, especially because it's got a bunch of air inside it. And then once it does, Cyclops like blasts the shit out of it right at the top, so they can get out. And they're like, "Oh, we did it!" And then the ship pops back up because it was in the island, and then I guess it didn't go with the island; it fell out of the island or some bullshit. Fair enough. So they all climb back in, and they're like, "Wow, there's like 13 of us. What are we going to do with the X-Men?" And that's the end of like the original Giant Size X-Men. All right, so then Giant Size X-Men 2 is just and then at the end of Giant Size X-Men 1, we get a recap. We don't even get a recap. We just get a reprint of like the Cyclops powers, Iceman powers, and Jean Grey powers from the previous series way back in like the 60s or whatever. The X-Men, Giant Size X-Men 2 is just a reprint. It's a reprint of like the Sentinel stories, which is good if at the time you were trying to follow along, because the Sentinels become like a very integral part of kind of the earlier X-Men stuff and just kind of X-Men going forward. So the fact that we got like a nice little recap story is important to kind of like, there's a lot of like Sentinel stuff going on, Sentinel lore. But I didn't really read it. I just kind of glanced at it and was like, all right, I've read all these stories recently. I don't need to do this again. And then the X-Men Volume 3. So then, okay, so at some point, I think in the 80s or 90s, they did like an update. They did like an HD remake of like the earlier X-Men, Uncanny X-Men stories, and they called it Classic X-Men. And so I looked into it, and like the Giant Size X-Men, like the Classic X-Men 1 is like a retelling of the. It's not even a retelling. It's like a sequel to the original Giant Size X-Men #1. In that it tells the Krakoa story like very quickly, like in like 2 to 4 pages, and then the rest of the book is like a direct sequel, like what happened to all the X-Men characters, like where'd they all go after this. So we'll talk about that, and then I'm gonna just read the Classic X-Men books and not the original Uncanny X-Men versions, because after doing a little research and looking around, it looks like they literally just reprinted the original X-Men stories, and then they would add like an epilogue or like a little side story, or they would add like a panel here or there. So they're like HD remakes where they just like smoothed out some stuff. Even the art looks almost identical for the most part. So I'm just gonna follow that. I think someone mentioned online that I was reading up to like Days of Future Past or something like that, but we'll see. But that apparently at the beginning of each issue it'll tell you like what it was added or what pages or whatnot. So that's what we're gonna go with. But for Giant Size X-Men, so for Classic X-Men, after we get like a short retelling of the Krakoa story, we pick up right where we left off, where Angel's like, I don't know what we're going to do with so many X-Men in the house. And we're going to have a lot of problems. So this part is just a retelling from the point of view of Professor X, who's using his telepathic powers to like observe everyone. So we start with Alex and Lorna, and they decide they're going to go back to school. They're going to go to grad school, and they're going to be done with neither of them feel like they're really like not that they're not a part of the X-Men, but neither of them feels like they're really superheroes or like really made for this life. And so they just want to go and like study and be kind of chill and be in love with each other. And it's very cutesy. Next we see, looking at my notes. We see Scott doing his after action report for Professor X about the whole incident. And then Jean is like, hey baby, I love you. So they're clearly a couple. And this is like the first time it's been very like, yes, they are together. Before it was like, yeah, they're together, I guess, sort of. Now it's like, yes, they know they're together. We get like a kissing scene, and she's like, come dance with me. Banshee's playing downstairs in like the music room, and he's like, oh, I gotta finish this. And then she's like, okay. And she kind of gets disheartened, and she just like heads outside, and she thinks to herself that she's kind of sad about the whole situation, but that she knows Scott loves her, but it's like, is it enough for her? Then we shoot back into the music room, and we see Banshee playing and enjoying himself, and then Peter's / Colossus is drawing, which is like, that's one of his main things he does, is draw pictures and stuff. And they're both enjoying each other's company, and Nightcrawler makes a comment about Colossus's drawing, and it's like, oh yeah, it is very good. And Colossus is like, oh, and he like turns into Colossus from Peter and tears his shirt, and he's like, oh, my shirt's torn. And Nightcrawler's like, I apologize, I didn't mean to do that, I'm sorry. He's like, it's okay. And so they chit-chat a little bit, and then Bobby comes in, he's like, fuck you guys. And Banshee's like, why you gotta be such an asshole, Bobby? And he's like, 'cause I am an asshole. Fuck you. And then Nightcrawler's like, hey, can we just all be friends and like get along? Like we're all mutants, we're all working together. And Bobby's like, no, fuck you. And then he wanders off. Like, that's not literally the words on the page, but it was like, God damn, Bobby, like get the fuck over yourself. And the Nightcrawler and Colossus feel kind of bad. And then Banshee's like, man, don't worry about that guy. He's like a teenager. He's a dummy. So Banshee and Nightcrawler are like, yes, I love this. I want to be an X-Men. I want to stay here. I want to do good. I want to be excellent. And then Colossus is like, I got to think about it some more. I don't know. I'm still not like sold on the whole thing. So then Bobby, who continues to be an asshole, bumps into Warpath next. And Warpath is just minding his own goddamn business. Like, literally. He's just in the hallway looking at pictures of the X-Men. He's like, wow, this seems like a really cool thing. I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I get to be a part of this team. I appreciate being here. And he's like, oh, hey, Bobby, what's up, man? Can you show me around here? Show me some of the secrets you guys got going on here so I can, like, incorporate myself more. And Bobby's like, fuck you. And then he, like, ices him up. And then Warpath, like, breaks out of the ice and is like, hey, quit being an asshole. We're all here together. Bobby's like, I don't want to be together. Meh. And so then he wanders off. And I'm like, man, fuck Bobby. Like, the fuck, dude? Like, I was just being nice to you. What an asshole. Then we go out to Jean, and Jean's doing more like Satapotamus stuff. And then all of a sudden, Wolverine's like, what up, beautiful? And she's like, oh my. And he goes like real hard in the paint. And she's like, I don't know. I don't know if we can keep talking. And he's like, I don't know. Your heart rate's up, and you seem very excited. I can smell it. So maybe we should talk some more. And she's like, oh my, I have the vapors or whatnot. And then we switch over to Aurora, who's just like flying around, being like, oh, this is nice. This is different skies and different stuff, but I think I'll like this a lot. And then Angel flies up, and he's a real creepazoid because he's like, what's up, pretty lady? We should definitely kiss and get to know each other more. And she's like, I don't understand this like strange mating ritual you're trying to initiate with me. And all of a sudden he's like, I gotta go, baby. I'll catch you later. And she's like, what? And he flies down and like grabs Wolverine and throws him into a tree. And he's like, leave Jean alone. That's not your girl. She's with somebody else. And then Wolverine obviously is like, the fuck, bro? And so he pulls his claws out, and then Jean tries to stop them from fighting. But Wolverine's like too berserked. He's got like this whole berserker thing he's going on. And Aurora has to use lightning and rain to like stop him and cool him off. And then he's like, all right, thanks, Aurora. And he starts to like meander, and then Jean's like, hey, I'm so sorry that Angel was acting like such an asshole. Angel, I'm talking about you. You're the asshole in this situation. And he's like, whatever. Blah, 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 blah. And then and Wolverine's like, thanks, Red. You're still smoking hot. If you want to bang, we can do it. And so then we go to like the next morning, and we have Professor X just kind of like thinking about all this stuff, and he's like, lots of things are going to change. And then Jean wanders in, and she's like, hey, Professor, I think I got to go. And he's like, huh? And she's like, I don't know if I can be part of the X-Men anymore. There's too much stuff going on with like Cyclops and this new Wolverine guy, and I got a lot of like, mixed emotions about like who I want to fuck and stuff like that. And then it's just like, I've always been an X-Men as long as I've been like an older teenager to adult, and I just never really did anything just for me. And so I think I need to take some time just to like be Jean Grey and not be Marvel Girl. And then they like hug it out, and it's a very sweet end to essentially the combination of like two giant-size X-Men stories. So Joss Whedon did a little bit of a side story in a giant-sized X-Men #3 that has to do with kind of like the current story. So it's pretty much just Wolverine walks in, everyone's standing around in like the danger room, and he's like, what's up, bitches? We ain't no team, and one of us is going to get kicked off this team. It's time to find out who. And then everyone starts like bad-mouthing each other and talking, and Wolverine pulls his claws out and talks shit towards Nightcrawler, and Colossus is sexist towards Storm, and then the Indian Warpath, and it's not even Warpath. Hold on, I think I wrote it down this time because I kept messing the fuck up. It is Thunderbolt, I want to say. T-Bird, yeah, T-Bird. So T-Bird, who's Warpath's older brother from the New Mutants / X-Force. All right, so then T-Bird and Sunfire are like, white man, white devil. Sunfire casts fire at Wolverine. Cyclops blocks it, sets the whole place on fire. Storm creates like a thunderstorm, gets kind of claustrophobic as we learn about more. And then T-Bird and Wolverine start fighting it out. Colossus is charged with lightning, which is causing problems, so Nightcrawler grabs Storm and gets her to stop. And then Wolverine throws T-Bird into Colossus, and then Banshee finally wanders in because he was like kicking it with Professor X because they're old buddies from back in the day, and just blasts everybody with his screech, and is like, "The fuck is wrong with you people?" And then Wolverine's like, "Well, there you go. Now we know each other's strengths and weaknesses." And he just moseys on out. What an asshole. Uncanny X-Men number 94 / Classic X-Men number 2, which is what I'm actually reading, continues forth the adaptation of the new X-Men, the new Uncanny X-Men. And it all begins with everyone kind of meeting up and kind of talking a little bit more. We had a couple, like the Giant Size X-Men 2 and a bit from the Classic X-Men number 1, which doesn't follow exactly through with what's going on. But we know that, the original X-Men are kind of like noping out, and that there's going to be some other issues. So first off is what's his name? Sunspire? Sunfire, that's his name. So Sunfire's like, "I am done, Gaijin, adios." So he leaves. Meanwhile, Storm and Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Colossus, and Thunderbird all talk about, they will stick around. Banshee's also about to go, but then Charles Xavier essentially taunts him into sticking around because by calling him out, being like, "Oh, you're an old man. You can't handle dealing with these young people. Good luck." And he's like, "No, I'm done." But the original X-Men who are left, namely Angel, Jean Grey, and Bobby, are all like, "We're done. We're moving out." And they don't seem so mad. I mean, Bobby gets into a fight with Wolverine, and Cyclops has to stop them. But they essentially are like, we spent our whole like young adolescent life, or like our teens, and we've been doing this for quote unquote years. And so we want to do something else besides just be X-Men all the time. Cyclops has some thoughts about that. Essentially, he just feels like he needs to stay and help guide the new X-Men forward, and also it's harder for him to adapt to like normal society, which he's done in the past, so I kind of think that's some bullshit excuse, but that comes up. Him and Jean Grey confess their love again, kiss. Lorna Dane and Alex Summers, Havoc, they leave as well, which we already knew they were kind of thinking about it. So next up, Cyclops takes everyone to the Danger Room, and they spend weeks / months training and exhausting themselves. And at some point, Thunderbird gets injured a little bit, and him and Cyclops get into a big row where Professor X has to intervene and command Thunderbird to take a chill pill and Cyclops to come talk to him. In their conversation, Cyclops expresses all his like doubts and about teaching like adults who have like lives instead of just teaching like other teenagers. Because again, he's no more than like 20 years old at this point, you gotta say. Meanwhile, like Wolverine's like 100 years old. Cyclops is like a kid. He's like 18, 19 maybe. But Nightcrawler's older, T-Bird's older, Aurora's older. They're not old. Aside and Banshee's like in his like 40s or 50s. He's already talking about getting gray hair and stuff. And Professor X considers like helping him more, but he feels like for Cyclops to grow, he needs to be more independent, so he allows him to do that. We get a little side story with Moira. This is the first time she's been introduced, along with Rain. Rain is a future member of the New Mutants, and a mutant who can transform into like a werewolf, essentially. And Moira is, she's had like relations with various X-Men, namely Professor X and Banshee, in and out of continuity. Heading back to New York, Aurora is flying around enjoying like the new land, and she sees Thunderbird about to jump off a cliff, and she stops him. And then they talk about how he's trying to keep up with the Joneses, and the Joneses being Wolverine. And she's like, "You don't have adamantine, unbreakable bones. Don't just jump off cliffs, you dumbass." And he's like, "I'll do what I want, woman." Oh, goodness. We move on to like NORAD in Colorado. They don't call it that. It's called like Valhalla or something. But we get a return of our best friend forever, Count Nefarious. Now, Count Nefarious, if you remember, he had a little arc back in the day where he got like these other super villains to like do some like bullshit in DC to try to take it over and like trick the X-Men into like helping him out and all this stuff. Now he's created, what does he call them? Animen? It's something ridiculous like that. I think it's Animen, which are like humans he's given like animal powers to, and then they have to serve him or he's going to never turn them back into human ever again. Anyway, so they take over the nuclear missile silo area, and his plan is, instead of just taking over like Washington D.C. or whatever he was doing before, is to take over the whole world. So he's gonna use this base of operations to do that. Cyclops is chilling, thinking about being sad about things he said to Thunderbird and whatnot. When Nightcrawler comes in and starts to like kind of counsel him, or he was like a priest, or he's very Catholic, so he likes talking to people and stuff. Kirk Wagner is awesome. But then they get a call from Professor X, and it's nefarious. So Beast, who is now a member of the Avengers, reaches out and says, "Hey, the Avengers got this call from the Air Force to help deal with this nefarious guy, and we figured since the Avengers are busy doing whatever bullshit they're doing, that you guys could take it over." And then Beast is like, "Hey, we're all the X-Men." It's like, "These are the X-Men now," and he's like, "All right, cool, sounds good." Thunderbird and Cyclops get into a little bit of a row again before they get into the Blackbird, which this is the first introduction of the Blackbird. Now, the X-Men have had various helicopters and jets and whatnot, but this is like the SR-71, made famous by the cartoon, and it continues to be good use going forward. There's some more like chit-chat before they get over there. They argue with like this army general who's surrounding, and then the Nefarious sees the X-Men are coming, so sends out some missiles to blow up the jet. Thank goodness they have like an ejection button, so they're able to get out. But then Nefarious uses like a sonic blaster or some bullshit to like, I don't even know what it does. It appears to just make the whole thing disintegrate, but the X-Men are all fine, and so they start to fall to their death. And that's the end of the main story. So the backup story, and this might I don't remember this story, so this might just be in the classic X-Men version of the Uncanny X-Men 994. This takes place at a different time. And Aurora is flying through New York, and she's talking about all the people living there and whatnot. And she's come to hang out with her best friend forever, Jean Grey. And we've never seen them talk, so I don't know when continuity this is supposed to take place, but it's in this issue, so we're going to talk about it. So she comes down. Her and Jean are chit-chatting, and then Jean reveals that she's got this nice apartment that she's sharing with Misty Knight of the Defenders, and just general being around, hanging out with different people. She's got like a bionic leg, I want to say, if I remember correctly. I don't know if she has it at this point, but she's like a street level kind of like investigator. She deals with like Daredevil, Luke Cage, stuff like that. So Jean Grey's like, "Hey, if you could change out of your X-Men uniform," she doesn't know I'm an X-Men. And Aurora's like, "Yes, I will be naked." And she's like, we got to get you clothes. So they squeeze Storm into one of Jean's clothes, which she mentions is tight, and then they say hi to Misty and head out. They get clothes. They get attacked by some skateboard punk who steals Jean's purse, and then they rush through the streets trying to find them. The kid dives into the subway tunnel, and Jean Grey heads after. Now, if you know anything about the X-Men, you know that Aurora Monroe, or Storm, is claustrophobic. So looking down into the tunnel, she has like a vertigo attack and can't follow. Jean Grey runs in, she catches the guy, but then like the train distracts her, and her emotions are kind of caught up, and she lets her quote unquote size screen down, and so she gets invaded with like the thoughts of everyone around her, and the kid gets away. So she heads up, and she's pissed, and Storm's just like up at the top of the subway being like a little sad hippopotamus, and Jean Grey like yells at her, and then Storm yells back, and then Jean Grey says that she knows that Aurora was buried as a child, and that's why she has claustrophobia, that's a fucked up thing to say. So Aurora gets pissed that like the Mind Witch is reading her mind and transforms into Storm, starts a big thunderstorm, pulls Jean Grey up. They get into like a little tit for tat up there, not fighting, just like women fighting, like discussing their issues. And Jean Grey like apologizes and she kind of apologizes. It's more she's like, "Well, you don't understand what it's like being able to read everyone's thoughts. It's not as great as you think it's going to be. So that's just as sad as you. And like, we just need to be friends and not be so fighting." And then, they like hug it out or whatever, and then feel bad that they treat each other poorly. So they go down, and then they, apologize, sort of. Again, they like woman apologize. And then hold hands and head down into the subway tunnel. Oh, goodness. Chronologically speaking, we have Giant Size X-Men number 4, which is very similar to the Giant Size X-Men number 3. It's like a future Joss Whedon project where he hits up like a little short story about something that happened like around this time. Before Count Nefarious, as we will soon see, that's the only possible way. So we have John Prounstar, who's Thunderbird, and Storm, Aurora Monroe, fighting it out in the Danger Room while everyone else kind of watches on. Storm's able to localize her storm abilities, her literal storm abilities, And then there's a conversation about having like another fight without powers. At that point, John Proudstar calls Aurora girl, and Aurora flips out and attacks him. And she starts punching and kind of like wrestling around with him. Wolverine acts like a tough ass, and then John Proudstar eventually gets the upper hand on Rogue and pins her to the ground. At which point she freaks out, and Wolverine has to step in to stop Aurora from attacking using her full force of her powers on John, because there was an incident we find out later by Professor X where she was like raped or almost raped by a man in Africa when she was a kid, and she killed him with a knife. And so she was having like flashbacks of that, and Cyclops kind of like failed at doing the right thing in this situation, and he kind of wanders off. Next we get a scene with Charles and Wolverine where Charles is kind of asking Wolverine to help be like the second in command of the X-Men. And Wolverine's like, I don't know about that, man. And Professor X is like, he just needs, his biggest problem is he doesn't believe that you believe that he can be a leader, and that makes him question himself. So if you can just do the right thing, that'll help. And then Wolverine mentions that him, Proudstar, and Aurora are all damaged goods. And outside we see John kind of like creeping and spying on the two of them talk. He then heads upstairs and sees Cyclops confessing to Jean Grey that he's doubting his leadership abilities, and she gives him like an encouragement, and he comments on like how weird it is. He gets to Wolverine's room and makes a couple comments about how Wolverine has his room set up to look like just he's a slob and a mess, but that everything is there for like very specific reasons. He then sees a picture of Wolverine during one of the wars and makes a comment about that to himself before sneaking out and heading to Aurora's room to apologize. When he gets there, he just finds a knife, and that's it. When Professor X shows up, one of the things, the cool like plot points of the comic we see is that John Proudstar like snuck into Wolverine's room and was like super sneaky, but that Wolverine was like there and he knew he was there because Wolverine's such a badass, especially in like the 90s when Joss Whedon was like writing it out. Like this is really when Wolverine became like super badass, best leader. It's like good times for Wolverine. He's super cool, and when he's in the New Avengers and stuff a little bit later too, in like 2006-ish. Yeah, it's super badass. All right, so then Professor X pops in and talks to John, and they just have like a chit-chat about secrets and about what's going on. And this is where we find out about Aurora's situation, and we don't get the full information, but he kind of gives them the information. And John's like, mentions that she doesn't have anything here, so like, does she really want to set up roots? And Professor X is like, maybe you could do something to help. And so then we get a shot of Aurora returning, and there's a cactus. She's like, what's this? And then there's a letter, and it says something like prickly on the outside, but delicious sweet meats on the inside. So I guess that's like his him being like, hey, we all got our issues, but I promise I'm not a total asshole. Good stuff. So back to the nefarious plot, the X-Men are falling to their death. Thank goodness two of them can fly, and one of them is Colossus, where he can just pummel into the ground. Meanwhile, Nefarious is threatening the president, saying he's going to blow everything up, and the Animen ask questions that everything also includes them, maybe? So maybe we should not blow everyone up? He's like, don't worry about it. We'll be fine. The X-Men come up with a scheme. Banshee's going to take John and go. Colossus is going to hurtle into the ground because he's like invincible, which Wolverine is too. I guess maybe not as much as at this point, because he feels the need to have Storm take him and Nightcrawler, while Cyclops waits for Banshee to return. And right as Cyclops is sweating like crazy and about to crash into a tree line, Banshee shows up and rescues him by the nick of his whiskers. Then we get a lot of John being like angry and upset and trying to like do this and do that. But then we go there. Cyclops asks Nightcrawler if he can teleport inside the mountain, or if he can teleport up to where the missiles came out so that he can get in and let everybody in. And eventually they use Banshee's like sonic abilities to kind of see where there's space, so Nightcrawler can teleport in, which works. So he teleports in and gets attacked by Frogman, one of the Animen, and they battle it out. Nightcrawler is victorious. He is able to get to the hatch that leads to the outside and gets it open right as like Frogman nopes out. The X-Men get in, and they get assaulted with heat and with gas, and bash through a wall to escape that, and then run into hypnotized soldiers, because one of the Animen, this ant lady, or bee, or some sort of bug lady, she can hypnotize people. So they Colossus protects them from the bullets, and then Aurora summons a flood to drive them away. And then again, Cyclops is like, "Hey, Wolverine, you lead the way since you actually have been here, and you're a master tracker." And John argues that he should lead the way, and he's just upset, and he's always upset. And then he gets attacked by like Gorilla Man and tossed into Banshee, knocking both of them out. So that leaves the rest of the X-Men to fight like Catman, Birdman, Firefly, like Bug Lady, Frogman, yada yada yada. And we get some nice battle scenes where they go back and forth, and they're helping each other out, and eventually they become victorious, which includes Cyclops being hypnotized he gets hypnotized, which makes him stop guarding his like laser beam, which ends up just destroying the lady who hypnotized him. Good job. Banshee and Proudstar are still knocked out, so the rest of X-Men are like, we got to go take care of this business, which was a bad decision, but they didn't know that. Meanwhile, and they're like trying to figure out how to shut this stuff down, but it's already like too late because at some point there's like a failsafe and the missiles will go off no matter what. And they've reached that point, so they're trying to figure out what to do. Banshee and Proudstar, meanwhile, they wake up and they see Nefarious running towards a jet after he set the missiles off, and so they chase after him. Now, John, Proudstar being a dumbass, jumps up on the jet and starts just bashing it as Nefarious tries to fly away, not realizing that Banshee can literally fly and knock this plane out of the air, and that catching Nefarious is not that important. Meanwhile, Xavier is like, hey, all that damage you guys did downstairs with the fighting, these missiles will not launch, so you need to go help Banshee so that John doesn't die. And then back to Proudstar just destroying this jet in mid-flight, and Banshee keep trying to get him to get off. Storm, when they get outside, they see what's going on. Storm goes to help Banshee, but then John has done enough damage to the plane that it like explodes and then crashes into the mountain, killing John Proudstar. And Professor X stays with him till he's completely dead and experiences all the pain and loss and everything. And this definitely has some like very negative effects on the team and how they feel about themselves and others. As this is classic X-Men, which has like the extra side story at the end, we get something good. And that is this mourning story. And so the X-Men have taken John back to like the Apache lands, and Charles is like really sad and thinking about it. Jean shows up and expresses condolences as well as an understanding, as she experienced her best friend's death when she got hit by a car and killed. So they've both gone through like a similar experience. They lost someone close to them. And how close John Proudstar was to Xavier. But still, it's one of his like wards. Then Colossus sees that the casket was broken into and John's body was taken away. So all the X-Men are about to like freak out and go find him when his parents, the Proudstar parents, show up, and they're like, "Please don't do that. Just let him, just let it be." And then they meander off. And then Wolverine's like, "Nah, I'm gonna hunt this guy down." It's like Opposite said. He's like, "They told you not to go," and he's like, "Whatever." And then Storm's like, "Maybe we should follow." So the X-Men go, leaving Jean and Professor X behind. Then we just get everybody kind of like having these nice little vignettes of them thinking about their interactions with John and things they could have done better, or feelings of guilt, except Wolverine. He was Wolverine. So he's just like, that guy was such a dumbass, should have hopped off the plane. What an idiot. And then he mentions James, who is Warpath, in the future, New Mutants. And he's like, it's probably James who took him, probably some like Native American thing. And he looks up and sees Banshee like screeching across the sky, and he's like, remind me never to bring that guy on a stealth mission. Banshee's really punishing himself, trying to like push himself, even though it's like hot, dry air and it's hurting his throat, because he really wants to make up for letting him die. Then we get Kurt and Colossus talking about their last experience with John, where they caught him in the danger room and he was like working himself to death, trying to get stronger, and they like were chit chatting with him. And Kurt feels sad because it's like John was like clearly depressed, and that he was like saying stuff and kind of joking about it, but it was clearly not a joke because he sacrificed his life. He didn't have like care enough for his life to take care of himself. And they're all talking about they're super hot. So Storm flies by overhead and starts like a rainstorm, and then comes down and starts talking to him, and she retells this experience she had, which kind of is a follow-on from the previous one where they were kind of like tight. And he's up there just hanging out in her like garden in the attic, and they're talking about John is just so damaged with like the stuff that happened in the war, and Aurora's kind of picking up on that because she's like, "What are you afraid of? You're like in a beautiful garden." And he says something about like the most beautiful things are the most dangerous, or something. It's all deception. And then she asks about his family and like a girl to love and like kid stories, and he's like, "No." And then the last little bit, we get Wolverine, who's caught up with James and is watching him do like whatever ceremony to the sun or whatever. And he finds like he finds John's like little cachet of like his honorable discharge, his medals, and the picture of him in like Vietnam, which I think is supposed to be Iraq, with like the updated timeline stuff that happens later. This is 70s, so that would be Vietnam. Okay. And he just kind of watches and hangs out, and he's like, all right, I'm going to head out before the other X-Men get here and kind of ruin this kid's like celebratory like thing. Um, and then he just kind of thinks to himself that like the X-Men need to learn that like life's valuable and that we got to take care of each other and, you know, not just do things to hurt ourselves. It's like really good Wolverine stuff that it's good character development that has like the original Wolverine when he joins, he's just like very hot-headed. And then these side stories are like, that's how Wolverine becomes later. So it's kind of interesting because it's like Wolverine, of course, is always going to be like that, quote unquote. People just have like radical changes in their personality, but this kind of retconning. It's interesting because I've never read this stuff. I only read the originals. I had like a omnibus of all the like the first, all the way to like Uncanny X-Men like 300 or something. Excuse me. And then we get James Proudstar just being, you know, finishing up his little ceremony and then swearing that the white man's war couldn't kill his brother, or that Xavier did it, and that he will someday get avenged on him.
Uncanny X-Men 96, or Classic X-Men number 4, which is I'm reading for the extra stories in the back, starts off with Cyclops wandering through the woods being sad-epotomous about Thunderbird, and he has a little bit of a breakdown after thinking about everything that just happened. He lets himself go, which means he blasts like the surrounding woodland and accidentally hits this random cairn that's just sitting out in the land at Professor X's mansion. And then like a dark cloud of pink gas like starts coming up from it. We then switch over to the danger room where everyone's having like a little fights, but and Wolverine loses it a little bit and has to get stopped by Banshee and Professor X. We then learn that Professor X has hired Moira McTaggart to come and be like a house helper while he goes on like a little vacation because he's tired of Potamus. And Banshee's, who's like the next adult in the room, he's like, oh yeah, cool, housemaid, which must be like some old woman, some old 70-year-old woman, old friend of Charles Xavier. And he opens the door and he's like, hot damn, this girl is fine. And him and Moira have like a whole situation going on, so that's fun for them. But this is where it all begins. And he gets off on the wrong foot by being like saying some like rude stuff to her. We did switch to what's this guy's name? Notes. Langford, I think. He's a big asshole, and he's being talked to by a colonel in the I would assume Air Force. And he has these plans to get this project, and he's like squirreled away all this money illegally and done all this like really shady stuff so that he can destroy all mutants with Project Armageddon. And then the colonel's like, you know what, I'm cutting this off. I'm going back to DC. We're ending this project. This is ridiculous. We're not going to start a war with mutants. That's retarded. And the guy's like, oh yeah? I'm going to kill you behind your back. Back at the X Mansion, Aurora's swimming naked as she does. And Nightcrawler comes out to swim too. And he's like, oh my god! And then he jumps and like stops the other X-Men from coming in. And they all see hot, naked Aurora. And they're like, damn, girl. And then Colossus, being the gentleman that he is, takes his t-shirt off to give to Aurora. And we see that he is ripped, son. And then Professor X, Aurora's like, I don't understand what the problem is. Professor X lets her know that, like, culturally speaking, it'd be better for the team if you just didn't go around completely naked. Sorry. And then him and Moira have a little talk, and you find out they had a previous relationship, but that's all kind of in the past, because he tries to reminisce with her about it, and she's like, no, we're moving past that point. The rest of the team meets Moira, and they're having, like, a good time just chit-chatting about stuff, when all of a sudden Cyclops comes blasting through the door, and his shirt's all torn up, and he's followed by this monster. Kiroladok, the Shatterer of Souls, I think. Something like that. He's this big red demon-looking monster, and they all start fighting him, and people are having like a real hard time, except Wolverine, who beats the shit out of him and kills him, quote-unquote. But not really, because Cyclops mentions he also defeated him a couple times, but every time he defeated him, the monster seemed to be stronger, like he's absorbing his energy or whatever, and then he gets back up. And so Professor X decides, all right, I'm going to telepath in there. And we get like a fever dream of like a panel where he like loses his mind for a second. And then Moira comes in with like an M16 and starts firing away at this thing. And Sean Cassidy, the Banshee, has to rescue her. And then Professor X is like, oh, there's a cairn out in the woods. We have to seal it. So Storm, go do that, and we'll hold this guy off for now. And then so Storm heads out, and there's a whole bunch of other like little minions that are servants of whatever like Nagog or whatever the god was. And so she gets attacked by them, and as she's trying to seal up the cairn, she starts to get dragged into the cairn by all these little monsters. And then she freaks out, and we finally get like her flashback to like when she was a kid and there was like an earthquake and she got trapped and she was alone, and because this thing's gonna like trap her, she freaks out and destroys it completely, which I guess is a way of sealing it, because then the monster disappears, and then everyone comes back and they're like, oh goodness, I hope that's the last time I've seen of them. And Professor X reveals that they like used to rule the earth and that they're super pissed they don't anymore. Anyway, the last panel of like the A story is an epilogue, and that Colonel Rossi or whatever, he's dead. So Lang, Stephen Lang, oh, is that Ant-Man? Anyway, the guy who was all pissed off and wanted to do Project Armageddon, he's watching and laughing, according to the byline. All right, so then the B story is all about Wolverine and Nightcrawler. So they're playing a game of like tag. So Wolverine's trying to catch Nightcrawler. Nightcrawler is being like he was like in the circus, and he talks about his time in the circus doing trapeze and tumbling and stuff. And then he can also teleport, so he's got the better of Wolverine for a bit. But then Wolverine finally gets him and checks him in the gut. And then they shake hands, and there was a bet. If whoever wins this game or loses this game has to buy beer or get the beer. And so Nightcrawler's going in the house to get the beer, and Wolverine's like, "Now let's get going." At this point, Nightcrawler pulls out this device. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like an image inducer, and it's from Tony Stark. Professor X got it for him, so that he can cover himself up and look differently. And then Wolverine kind of makes a comment about not being necessary, but you do you. And they go to like this Harry's pub. I think it's Harry, who's been here forever. And then Wolverine and Nightcrawler just chit-chatting about like whatever bullshit, being in the circus and stuff and being a freak. And then Wolverine keeps like harassing him about like being his true colors and that he needs to trust people more and not be so concerned. So Nightcrawler finally gives up and he turns the transducer thingy off. And then Harry comes by and like nods at him and gives him beer. And then they leave and go for a walk down the road, and they get some like comments, and he helps like a lady, and she says he's very handsome and all this cute stuff. And some kids see him and they're like, "Oh, that's cool, it's an alien." And then some asshole from like not this area shows up, and he puts his hands on like Nightcrawler's face like a real jacka mode. And so Nightcrawler like grabs him, and then Wolverine tackles him and is about to cut him up real good before Nightcrawler like bounces out with both of them, and he's like, "Hey, try not to kill people." And Wolverine's like, "Yeah, that's a good point." And that's the end of the issue. All right, Uncanny X-Men number 87, classic X number 5 for the extra fun stories at the end. Professor X is having a nightmare. He's seeing what we will future find out is the Shi'ar battle cruisers, and specifically, I think it's Ileana. No, Ileana's Colossus' sister. I can't remember her name. We'll get there. But he's having dreams about spaceships and fighters and stuff, all this fun stuff, and like a woman calling out to him and reaching out to him. And then he wakes up, and Moira's like, "Hey, you okay?" And he's like, "I'm having that nightmare again." And she's like, "It's going to be okay. You got to let the X-Men know so you're not freaking out so much." We then skip over to New Mexico. I think they're in New Mexico. It's like Rio Diablo or something, and that's where Alex and Lorna are working on their PhDs in geology or whatever. So Alex heads out to like look at rocks and shit, and Lorna stays home to be a good housewife when there's a knock at the door, and she opens it up and she's like, "Oh no, it's you, it's impossible," and then she gets shot. Alex meanwhile is and before that happened, she was reminiscing on how much she loves Alex, and then Alex is out meandering about, and he's thinking about how he feels bad for Cyclops because he got adopted and Cyclops didn't, and then how much he loves Lorna Dane and how he understands Jean and Cyclops' relationship. And then he hears a scream and he runs back and he sees Lorna putting on this like crazy outfit, and then she zaps him. And then Lorna's talking to somebody and he's like, "Oh good, you didn't kill the boy, we need him." We then skip back up to New York where Professor X is getting ready for his like little vacay business, and Jean, Cyclops, Colossus, and Nightcrawler are all there to wish him goodbye, along with, no, I don't think Moria's there. No, Storm's there, if I remember correctly. Banshee and Moira are out on like a date. Ooh. Which I think Jean comments on, which is pretty funny. And then they see some people dressed in very odd costumes, and then Cyclops turns around and sees Havoc and what is it? Polaris? Yeah. And then Polaris zaps, who's Lorna Dane, zaps Jean, and then Cyclops gets super concerned and is about to zap her, and then he gets zapped by Havoc, and then Charles Xavier's plane like takes off real fast, and then Lorna and Alex run after him, and Nightcrawler and Colossus transform because Nightcrawler's using his like transformation thing to look like Errol Flynn essentially, and Colossus changes his still form, and they chase after and knock Havoc down, and he blows up like a giant plane, which is awesome. It's an awesome panel. Which luckily no one's on there. Don't worry, everybody. It wasn't a tragedy. But this Havoc's like trying to fight this mind control, and then we see it's dun dun dun. Eric the Red. That's right, Eric the Red, as in the person Cyclops made up. He's very confused about this whole thing. But Cyclops, Colossus, and Nightcrawler start trying to fight Eric the Red, and he's very strong. And then hold him off. And then Havoc like fights up against the mind control stuff and shoots Eric the Red, and then Eric the Red zaps him with some more mind control rays out of his eyes. Meanwhile, Aurora is carrying Jean Grey away. She's kind of like knocked unconscious by Lorna's attack, and Lorna, as Polaris, flies after him using her like obvious magnetic powers, and she zaps Storm, and Storm almost loses Jean Grey, but catches her and sets her down on the building to turn around and start fighting Lorna Dane. And then so we got Havoc and Cyclops fighting, and then Storm and Polaris fighting, and then Eric the Red is being assaulted by Colossus and Nightcrawler, and we get a few pages of that with some planes blowing up and some fire, and eventually Aurora like goes Super Saiyan and blasts the shit out of Polaris, and then Havoc, seeing that she's getting the shit blasted over, he gets super mad and he blasts Cyclops like superpower, and then he grabs her. Finally, the Banshee and Wolverine like roll in, and Eric the Red's like, "Whoop, time to go!" And he grabs Alex and Lorna and takes off. And Cyclops has a shot, but he doesn't take it. And then Wolverine's like, "The fuck, man!" And then he's really ramming into Cyclops, who turns around and smacks Wolverine. And Wolverine's like, "I will fuck you up." And then Aurora grabs him by the shoulders and is like, "No, no, 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 you will not." And Cyclops is walking off, being real sad, eponymous. And then we see the asshole from before who killed that colonel. He's watching them. But then it looks like Eric the Red's watching that guy. So those are all sorts of like Inception levels of plots and schemes going on. That's into the A story. So the B story just focuses on Colossus. He's at the, I think, Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. He's painting these two guys just sitting around playing chess. We get like some beach scenes, whatever. And then Colossus hears a woman screaming in Russian, so he goes and sees her being kidnapped. So he leaps on this vehicle, beats the shit out of it, beats up these guys, and they go running off. And then he gets her out, right? But before he gets her out, he transforms back into his human self, obviously. And everyone's like, "Oh, you did a great job, son. Thank you so much." And then he goes back and talks to the chess guys, and they're like, "Dude, great job." So then the girl starts flirting with him, obviously, because he's a super handsome, ripped dude. And she's like, "Oh, I escaped communist Russia to come to America for ballet," and they have like a chit chat about that. And he's like, "Oh, I'm just a student. My parents are cool with it." And she's like, "My parents are not." And she's like very flirty with him, calling him like my champion and all this stuff, and invites him to the Lincoln Center, I'm pretty sure, or the Met. Are those the same place? Anyway, and not the Met, the museum, like the Metropolitan Opera House. Anyway, where she's performing something with fire and stuff, and he's like, "Ooh, it's so good, it's so good." And then she asks him to wait for her outside, and he waits for a couple hours, and she comes out, and they like kissy, and then they're like holding hands and walking around. But then those douchebags show up again the next day to kidnap her, and Colossus transforms into a still form and beats the shit out of him, which causes Anya, I think is her name, to freak out and run away and be like, "A metal man cannot have a heart." And then we get like a super sad hippopotamus like page. Like if you've ever seen that meme with like, I think it's Chavez, and he's like standing around being sad, and it's like, "This is how I feel waiting for like the Elden Ring downloadable content to come." And it's just like pictures of him looking sad, like sitting and standing and looking around. That's what it's like. It's literally like Colossus, and he's this girl, like he drew like a picture of her as a ballerina because Colossus is really good at drawing. And she threw it on the ground and ran off, and he picks it up, and then he just like stands all day at this like railing, and it's very well done. And then at the very end, when it's like nighttime, he tears the picture up and throws it on the ground and walks off. And it's like, oh, poor Colossus. That's okay. He gets Kitty Pryde later, and she's awesome. We wrap up the second Genesis arc with a few kind of like side stories. So the first is an amazing Spider-Man number 161 and 162, where Nightcrawler is reading a newspaper, and apparently at this point in time, Spider-Man is being called the killer by J. Jonah Jameson, who loves to rag on Spider-Man. So Nightcrawler is reading this newspaper. Wolverine like interrupts him and shreds the paper, and then he gets into like a row with Nightcrawler, and then Colossus steps in to like interrupt, and Nightcrawler's like, I'm out of here, bitches. And he takes off. So then Spider-Man's with his girl Mary Jane at the carnival of some sort, or like a Coney Island or whatever. And Nightcrawler is there too. He's going there to like meet a friend or something. But then it seems like his friends get shot. And so then it becomes this like complicated web of things where Nightcrawler's trying to figure out who shot his friend, and then Spider-Man's also trying to figure out, and then they bump into each other. Nightcrawler happens to have the rifle because the guy who shot Nightcrawler's friend is it, like took off, and then Nightcrawler wanted to make sure the rifle got to the correct authorities, and then him and Spider-Man start fighting because Nightcrawler just read a newspaper about how Spider-Man's a killer, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and eventually Nightcrawler decides that Spider-Man's a good guy because he couldn't be the shooter, and that he needs to like bounce out. And so then he kind of like, they like break apart for a little bit, and then Spider-Man does some other bullshit, and then they start fighting again, like on the Brooklyn Bridge, or something. And then right at the end of issue 161, Spider-Man and Nightcrawler are kind of like chit-chatting, and then a cable car comes up, and it's the Punisher, who's like, "I'm gonna kill all you motherfuckers." And so issue 162 starts off with Nightcrawler and Spider-Man fighting together against the Punisher, and they run back and forth. And the Punisher is claiming that Spider-Man's pretending to be the Punisher or something, and it's a whole like mess. And so then they start getting shot at again, and Nightcrawler has to like peace out because he's like tuckered out. But he sees the guy who has the rifle, and it's not the Punisher or Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man and the Punisher kind of like nope out as well. So bullshit goes on, and eventually Jigsaw, who is a Punisher villain, captures Spider-Man and is gonna like, he wants to kill the Punisher, and he's using the Spider-Man as bait to get him to come. But then Nightcrawler shows up, he's been following the Punisher the whole day to try to figure out where this whole thing is going out. So Nightcrawler starts punching dudes, and then he gets hit pretty hard by Jigsaw. So Spider-Man breaks out, and then the Punisher shows up, and he starts firing down into this group, and then they just beat the shit out of him completely and defeat Jigsaw. And then Spider-Man like apologizes to Nightcrawler, and then he like bamps out of there, and then he's like, "Oh, okay, well, thank you, Punisher." And the Punisher's gone, and Spider-Man's like, "Well, guess that's how it's going to be." Wah, wah, wah. So that's the second That's the second Genesis arc, the introduction of the new X-Men and them getting started with their stuff. We're going to have a follow-up with the Phoenix stuff. There's like the pre-Phoenix and then the whole Phoenix saga business, which is coming up next. But first, we're going to take a little dalliance. There's a couple what-if issues that fall place here, and that'll be the next video. But thanks for riding along. Go ahead and like, subscribe, and share, comment, or whatever, and I will catch you all later.